Hey everyone, welcome to the identity module. And you may wonder why identity is so early on in the course. And there's actually a number of reasons for that. If we think of our cloud world, identity is the new security perimeter. I can't lock things away anymore in my network with just a firewall. Instead, the identity is really the place where I can assign the permissions to the various resources I need. And if I think about, well, my resources go and live in the cloud, I can't use the network as that single perimeter. So it's critical to understand, architect, and operate your identity solution correctly. And that also does include educating your users. You want your users to be aware of the different types of attack that they may experience. So in this module, we're going to look at the basics of identity. So that includes both the traditional Active Directory domain services, but also Entra ID, which is the new name for what was Azure AD. So if you hear me say Entra ID, realize that is the new name for Azure AD. We'll also look at how Entra relates to your Azure subscriptions. We're going to look at conditional access. This is a huge feature of Entra, and it's a way of placing requirements when I want to access resources. I can do things like require strong authentication, like multi-factor authentication, passkeys. We'll also look at key concepts such as just-in-time permissions through things like privileged identity management. We always want to think just enough and just in time, and that's a huge way of achieving that. So, why do we need identity as a tool? In our interactions with services and resources, there's often the requirement to give different identities, different levels of access. Not everyone gets the same access. And the goal is to always give whatever identity we're dealing with the minimum possible set of permissions, just enough for it to be able to perform the required function, i.e. just enough or least privilege. If I have more permissions than required, well, this is a risk. It increases the risk of accidental. I do something, and because I have so many permissions, it has some massive impact, or deliberate. Maybe a bad actor gets hold of that credential and can then do bad things. So we want to only have the minimum possible requirements and permissions to do the job. We'll also talk later on about adding in those permissions to an identity only at the time they need them and not just sitting around all the time. Now, the way this works is we typically are going to group sets of permissions or actions into roles. And then I can grant that role to a specific security principle, saying I can authenticate as a specific scope. So if I take a look for a second, and if I think about, well, I've got me as some identity, and what we have here is a whole set of possible actions or permissions. Now, rather than having to grant every permission individually, because there could be hundreds, what we do is we group these into roles. And these would be sets of permissions or actions that are very commonly required to perform some certain function. And what we're going to do is we're going to grant a certain identity, a certain role at a specific scope. Now, the scope could be, hey, it's all of my identity system. If I was thinking Azure, it could be, oh, it's only a certain subscription or a certain resource. And this is called a role assignment. I'm granting a role to an identity. And when I use that term, an identity here, what's important is there are different types of identity. So we always think about the idea that, well, okay, it's a human being, but that's not the case. It could be many other types of things. So, for example, an identity could absolutely be a human, but it could also be an application. It could be some type of automation. I've written a script that does something. Well, it has to be able to perform functions against a resource, so it needs to act as an identity. It could be a device. There are many other types of things available. And the whole reason, again, we have this scope is so I only have the permissions at the point in which they're actually required. So this is always a key point that we have to have in mind. Now, you may wonder, well, why do I need a separate identity for every single app or every single human or every single automation? Why can't I just share them? There's multiple challenges with that. Chances are different people, different automations need to perform different functions. They need different sets of permissions. So if they share an identity, well, the permissions that identity will have will be the sum of everything required to do all the different things it has to do, which means it's going to be over-permissioned for any one particular requirement. Also, I want to be able to audit. I want to be able to see who did what when. If multiple actors, multiple humans, multiple automations are using the same account, I have no idea which one actually did the thing. I'll just see a log entry for this shared identity, but I won't be able to be very granular of knowing, well, who actually did what. And that's obviously a very, very bad thing. I need that granularity. So I grant those roles at certain principles, at certain scopes. My actors should be uniquely identifiable, as we talked about. And I need a central store for the identities and then the different capabilities to use them. So the whole point here is I want to be able to have identities. I want to be able to grant permissions to certain types of resources. And if I want to be able to use a certain identity, well, I need to be able to prove I am allowed to act as that identity. So there has to be this central store of identities that holds the identities, that holds the ability for someone to be able to prove they're allowed to use it. So this is commonly known as an identity provider. So I could think about I have an IDP, an identity provider. So this central store, this identity provider, maintains the list of service principals, the accounts that I can perform authentication against. And at a very minimum, it's responsible for enabling that authentication so someone can go and act as that identity. So I can think about, hey, this human being right here, what actually I have to be able to do is against this identity system, I want to be able to authenticate. So I'm just going to say auth-n. So authenticate. Prove I am who I say I am, or prove at least I have the knowledge that says I'm allowed to use this identity. So we think of that as a password commonly. Maybe it's having some certificate that I can use to do some cryptographic operation. Maybe it's possession of some physical token. And so I can perform an authentication against that identity provider, and it's then going to give me some kind of token, and it's going to give that to me. Now, what's also happening here with this identity provider is there's various applications. So there's kind of app 1, and I can say there's app 2, and they trust particular identity providers to perform this authentication. And what they can then do is, because they trust this identity provider, well, this is where I can grant the roles. I can authorize it to do certain things. So if this is Bob, and Bob has an account, I can give Bob a specific role for this particular application. So then Bob, after having authenticated to the identity provider and getting the token for app 1, can then give that token to app 1, and now, great, I can go and consume that application. And we think about from an Entra perspective, you have a certain tenant. And if you're using Azure, using M365, you're already using Entra as we're going to see. But Entra ID is Microsoft's enterprise identity provider. And again, it might also perform certain types of authorization. It can require certain things to be in effect, like I require strong authentication. I want you to have performed MFA. But the key element to this, if I look at this picture for a second, what's interesting here is this identity provider is in the middle. There's the humans, the users, there's the applications. The identity provider is in the center of this picture. So the identity provider holds the accounts. It owns the accounts. And there are some caveats with that have really led to a new type of thing. So what we also have now is something called decentralized identity. Now, this is really a to be aware of type piece of information, but it is gaining momentum. I have a full 90-minute video if you're really interested on that. But first, ask yourself a question. As a human being, what really is your identity? Is it the things you say about yourself? It's not really. If I say something to someone, they probably don't trust me. Can I get on a plane at an airport based on my word? Can I get a loan from a bank based on my word saying I work somewhere and earn a certain amount? No. I need a government-issued ID. I need a proof of employment from my company. I need artifacts from these other entities that others trust that I can then present and verify information about myself. From a government ID, it's tamper-proof. It has a little hologram. So the verifier, the person I give that ID to, can prove it really came from the proper person. And often I'll store these little artifacts in a physical wallet, a purse. The digital world is really no different. My digital identity is more about what others who are trusted in general will attest about me. And my digital identity is really the sum of what all those other people will attest. So, what we want to do here with decentralized identity is remember in the past, the identity provider was in the center of the picture. The user authenticated to the IDP that holds the credential, and the app trusts the identity provider. And we're really trusting that that identity provider won't overshare the information it knows. We trust it does a good job of confirming identities, that it's transparent with what it shares. And if you really think about it, you don't really own that identity. It could be taken from us at any time if we have some kind of disagreement with the identity provider, if we don't adhere to its policies. So with decentralized identities, the user is in the middle of the picture. They own and control the use of the identity. The information shared that makes up that identity, the user has complete control of what actually gets shared or doesn't get shared. So the key point here is the user owns the identity. They control the information shared. Other entities will then issue these verifiable credentials where my identifier is the subject to me that I can then choose to share with some verifier. And I can also choose exactly what is shared with them. I don't have to share all of the information. And it's rooted in a trust system. So if we jump over and so let's remember, this was the traditional picture. The identity provider was in the middle. So what we're now going to look about is the idea that, well, now I'm the user still. And the key part here with this user scenario is the user has their own digital wallet. It's some kind of user agent, some application. And we're going to have one or more decentralized identifiers. So this is identifying and mine. And then, we have our digital wallet that we're going to be able to put these different verifiable credentials in. So I have my digital wallet. So this decentralized identifier can be resolved to something called a DID document that provides information and the cryptographic information required to validate it. Now, again, it's what about others will say and attest to us, not what we say about ourselves. And so then we have the concept that we have an issuer. This could be a government agency, it could be my employer, it could be a video store, whatever that might be. This issuer has their own DID as well. But what they're going to do is they're going to create a verifiable credential. My DID is the subject of whatever this is, and they are going to populate claims about me into this verifiable credential. And they're going to give it to me, and it's going to go into my digital wallet. Now, underneath all of this is some kind of trust system. It varies exactly what the trust system is. There are different solutions to this. It could be based on some kind of blockchain. But what's happening is this is being rooted in this shared trust system. Now, I want to now talk to some verifier. So now we've got a verifier. And what will happen is the verifier will say, hey, I want some information. I now have to give consent. So I give consent to say, yes, I'm willing to share. So I have full control over it. Yes, I'm willing to share, and I can now share that verifiable credential to them, which they can validate through the trust system that it really came from what it's saying it is, because there's cryptographic operations, and when it's validated, great, they then trust it. But a key point here is I don't have to actually share the entire verifiable credential. Maybe I have to prove I'm old enough, I'm over 21. But I don't want to share my actual birth date, which is maybe in my government-issued verifiable credential. I can opt to say, I'm not going to share my birth date, but it can share the fact that I'm over 21 with this verifier party. So I have complete control. And again, the verifier, through that underlying trust system, can validate the authenticity of the various claims. And it's all bound in my wallet. I'm not relying on a centralized identity provider to be functioned or anything else. I am in the center of this picture, which is why it's a decentralized identity. Now, there are many open standards around this. There are many different wallet technologies. The Microsoft Authenticator app is one such wallet. This is called the Microsoft Entra Verified ID, but there are many other ones around for this. Now, again, this is really just a side item. It's something that's good to be aware of. It's starting to gain more traction as sort of things go on. It's not something you're going to need to deal with a lot today, but it's gaining momentum. And sometimes you might even see, hey, I want to go and on board to a company and they're asking for a verified ID. This is what it is. It's the idea that you're going to have this digital wallet, and it's good to at least understand what it's actually doing. But onto the focus of what we're really going on is Entra ID. Because today, for most use cases, and certainly for Azure, I do need a centralized identity provider. It's hosting the identities for our users, for our computers, for our applications, our groups. It's trusted by all of our various subscriptions. And the IDP for Microsoft corporate world, well, this is Entra ID. Now, it was formerly known as Azure AD, as I mentioned. It's been renamed. I think it was a good thing to rename it. I think the Azure AD name was terrible. It made you think it was the traditional on-prem Active Directory running in the cloud, which it was not at all. It was a completely different type of directory service, so it's been renamed. Entra was a brand they were starting to use for other identity and some security-related technologies. If you think about Entra, the entrance to my services. So I think it made sense to really changed the name to better represent what it really was. All of the Microsoft clouds will require you to have an Entra tenant. That's going to have the various accounts and policies that are specific to your organization. So Azure, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, etc., they are all going to require you to have an Entra tenant. And what's happening here is the Microsoft services that you have purchased as your organization will trust your specific Entra tenant. So let's go over here. So your company is going to have your own Entra tenant. This is going to contain your users, your groups, your devices, and the specific services you use. These could be your specific Azure subscriptions. This could be, hey, you've got M365. It might be there's third-party SaaS applications. These trust your specific tenant. Which is why, hey, if I'm in an Azure subscription for my company, I'll see my company's users as available to give permission. If I'm in my company's SharePoint site, I'll see my users as available to give permission to things. I don't see other companies. And when we talk about these other SaaS applications, Entra has thousands of existing federations with really all of the big third-party SaaS applications. Now, you can add your own. I can add additional OAuth and OIDC apps. I can even publish my on-prem apps via Entra. So it's not just for Microsoft properties. The goal here is this identity I'm going to have as the user, as the automation, whatever that might be. I can use that single account against all of the different applications that we may have in our environment. And again, when you're using Azure, your Azure subscription trusts a specific tenant. That's really a key point. They're all trusting a particular tenant, not just every tenant in the world. Now, I did say, as mentioned over here, Entra ID is not Active Directory in the cloud. They are really completely different. Yes, the commonality is they provide identity in some way, but they provide it in a completely different manner. They're not doing the same thing. If I think for a second about traditional Active Directory. So traditional Active Directory, it was Active Directory Domain Services. And really, Active Directory Domain Services was focused on providing identity capabilities for my closed network, for my specific set of devices. It used Kerberos, hence the t-shirt, primarily for the authentication. There's also NTLM, but that's really being deprecated out for authentication. It could use LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, to go and do queries and find information out. And these protocols, they work over a very wide range of ports between the various entities on the network. They have a shared secret with Active Directory Domain Services that is pivotal as part of the authentication process, i.e. the machines have to actually go and join the domain. I have a structure. We have something called organizational units. So we have these OUs that enable us to actually create this hierarchical structure of the different objects I have. And to those organizational units, I could apply different policy. I could do delegation, so I could give someone permission just to be able to manage objects in this OU and the child OUs. I could use it for certain elements of separation. There is no structure like that in Entra. If we think of the services today, remember, these services typically live in the cloud. They're being communicated to over the network. We can't and wouldn't want to open all of the different ports required, for example, for Kerberos authentication. It doesn't make sense. And also, Kerberos requires that secret, which we won't have for all of the different devices that exist out here. often in the cloud, I want to consent for some service to work on our behalf. I authorize something for us rather than it authenticating directly as us. Now, you may be thinking, wait, I could do this before with Active Directory. And this is true. There was the option for Active Directory, you have something called ADFS, and there were third-party solutions as well. So with Active Directory Federation services, yes, I could go and manually create these federations with SaaS applications, for example. But I would have to have a whole set of infrastructure I would have to manage. I'd have to manage all the certificates. There's a whole set of public-facing stuff I have to interface with and protect. And honestly, most organizations just don't want to deal with that. I had some policy capabilities, but they're super limited compared to what I can do with the policies around Entra. So by and large, this is not something people really want to deal with anymore. They'd rather let Entra do it with all of its federations. It just makes more sense for most companies. Now, compare this to Entra. Entra is built for the cloud. It's designed to use cloud protocols. So remember, we want to be talking TLS encryption over HTTP. So we need things that work over HTTPS. So it's just a single port. So it speaks cloud authentication. We have OpenID Connect, OIDC, for authentication. We have OAuth 2 for authorization. We can do things like SAML and WSFed, again, to give permission to various things. It does have some limited Kerberos capabilities. That's really built for specific Azure services, some of the Azure file stuff, some of the Azure Virtual Desktop, but it's fairly limited in its capabilities. If I want to go and interact, maybe it's for management purposes, maybe it's to go and query for objects, it uses a RESTful API. So again, it's working just over an encrypted port, and it has something called the Microsoft Graph. So we have the MS Graph that is really a standard to talk not only to Entra, but I can use the Microsoft Graph to find information about my M365 environment, my Dynamics environment. It's this very rich set of capabilities for create, for read, update, delete, sort of CRUD operations. There is no concept of OUs in Entra. It's flat. You're going to hear me talk about administrative units later on for more granular delegation, but it's not a hierarchy of the objects. It's really just a capability for how I can restrict certain types of administrative permission. Now, there are different licensing SKUs available for Entra. So if we actually go and take a look at this for a second. So there are different plans, and primarily what you're breaking it down into, yes, there's free, but then you have these Enterprise P1, and it's per user per month, Enterprise P2, and then something called the Entra Suite. So the Entra Suite builds on Entra ID P1, so you have to have P1 licensed, but then you add on the Entra Suite, which includes all of the P2 features, then also includes a whole bunch of rich capabilities like the private access, the verified ID, which remember is part of its decentralized capabilities. Yeah, it has all of the rich governance features, which P2 has some of them, but not all of them. The P2 adds identity protection, so it understands risk and user risk and sign-in risk. It has a whole set of capabilities around that. And as mentioned, there is, I think if we scroll down, there is the free license, which has some basic capabilities. But for most organizations, you're going to want to have, at minimum, the P1 license. Now, the nice thing, remember, is these licenses are per user per month. So I don't have to license every user the same. I could absolutely have some users, maybe a more basic set of requirements, have a P1 license. I could have other users, maybe they're more admins, they do more risk-based things, they can give a P2 license. Some others want the Entra Suite, but I can give the licenses very specifically based on the features they need. I don't have to just give some massive license and it has to be the highest common denominator. It's per user per month is how I can actually go and perform these various licensing. Okay, so how do you get Entra ID? And the good news is you probably already have it. As we already mentioned, Entra ID is the identity provider used by the Microsoft services, and many other services hook into Entra. So yes, M365, yes, Dynamics 365, Azure subscriptions, but huge numbers of capabilities, even third-party SaaS solutions now tie into Entra as the standard identity provider for everything they want to do. And remember, the key point here is your organization. When I drew this idea of the Entra, your org has your own Entra tenant. So you have your tenant that has some name, and by default, this tenant is actually going to be a name.on Microsoft.com. But we'll see in a second we can change this. So you have your tenant that has your users, groups, devices, policies in. You may hear it called a directory. It's really saying the same thing. And again, the tenant's going to be named whatever you specified at the time at creation. So for example, mine might be saviltech.onmicrosoft.com. And obviously this is an Azure course. And if I look at an Azure subscription, we'll see, so let me jump over for a second. Let's jump over. Let's close this down. So if I look at my Azure subscription right here, if I look at a particular sub, it trusts a specific directory. So if I zoom in, I can see it's trusting Saviltech, saviltech.net. And it does give me the option to change directory. So I could click this button, I'd have to do like a strong authentication, and I could change it to trust a different directory. But realize it looks like it's an easy button to push. This would have a huge impact. Remember, this directory contains my objects, my special applications, my groups. And they're the things that I give permissions to within my Azure subscription. Well, if I tell it now to trust a different tenant, which would have different identities, all of the assignments I had configured would be lost. All the things like managed identities, which are special and we'll talk about, would not be there. I would lose all of my permissionings. So while, yes, I can change the tenant, if I have actual services deployed, generally it is not something I'm going to do. It's going to break everything. It's a really bad situation to be in. So I mentioned the idea that it has this default .onmicrosoft.com name, but I can add custom domain names, which is what you're going to do. You're probably not going to want your users to see something .onmicrosoft.com. So once again, if we jump over, but this time we'll go and look at the Entra portal. If I go and examine my identity area, I'm going to do show more. There was a little button there. And I can now go to my settings and I'll see domain names. So I've gone to my settings and my domain names. You can then go and add additional domain names. All you have to do is prove you own it by basically, typically you're going to create a record in your zone. So I've added saviltech.net, but you can still see that default one, saviltechlab.onmicrosoft.com. And I've actually changed it so that my primary DNS name is the custom one I have added. I don't want to use the onmicrosoft.com. That's not a great experience for what I want in my environment. And so here in this example, yes, you absolutely get this tenant name you give .onmicrosoft.com, but what you're pretty much always going to go and do is you're going to go and add some custom DNS names. So your company probably has a presence and you're going to go and add that name as a custom name, and then you can make it to primary. So it's then very easy to go and use and leverage in the environment. Now, I mentioned if you're an M365 customer, which many people are, you already have an Entra tenant. Now, you may think, no, I don't have an Entra tenant. I have an M365 directory service. There is no such thing as an M365 directory service. It's using Entra. Now, when you go into the Office portal, yes, it does show you the ability from the M365 Admin Center. I do see users. So yes, it does give me users, but this is still just hooking into the Microsoft Graph. It's still just hooking into your Entra tenant. This is not a separate tenant in any way. All of the users you're seeing here are exactly the same users I see in the Entra portal. So don't think, oh no, I don't use Entra, I use M365. No, it's an Entra tenant. It just was created as part of your onboarding to the service, and you're leveraging it via that. When I do Entra management, there actually used to be a separate Entra PowerShell module if you like doing automations, but now you just use the Microsoft Graph PowerShell module. There aren't any separate modules you ever actually need to use anymore. Now you can go and create additional tenants. So yes, I'm managing it through the Entra portal, and yes, there's some elements in the Azure portal as well, and the Office portal as well, but the Entra portal is the primary place to manage Entra ID and the Microsoft Graph through APIs, through PowerShell. And you can add additional tenants as you need to. They're free. Now, obviously, if I then need to go and do various licensing, and there's different licensing options where, hey, if I have a license in one tenant, it can apply to other tenants my organization owns. But I can just jump over, and within the Entra portal, if I go to the overview, so I'm in overview, you'll see there is a manage tenants option. And from there, I can just go and add. I can create tenants. And is it a workforce, i.e. for my company, or is it external, i.e. it's a customer facing with customer accounts with my customer facing applications? And I would just go ahead and create as need. You can see here I've got multiple tenants based on different things in my lab environments and just the things I play around with mainly. But you may have more than one tenant. Now, what I would say is ideally you don't want to just go and create huge numbers of tenants. It complicates things. So there may be scenarios where I want a sandbox tenant. Maybe I've done a merger, so now, yes, I'm going to have a tenant from the company I've purchased, but you want to try and keep it as simple as possible where you can. Entra ID Objects. There are many types of objects in Entra. Many of them are security principals, which is some entity that I can be authenticated as. It has some way to prove I'm allowed to use it. There's some secret, like a password. There's some public key where I need the private key to perform some cryptographic operation. But there's some way to prove I'm allowed to use that identity. And users are the most fundamental type of identity we see. And the key point here is when I say user, it should be some carbon-based life form. It should be tied to a specific carbon-based life form. Remember, we don't want to share accounts between multiple people. I lose the ability to audit. It tends to get these inflated permissions. And my emphasis on the carbon-based nature is really important. If I have some kind of automation running, if I have an application running where it's not sitting at a keyboard, it's not using a mouse, it doesn't have the ability to operate a phone or use a token, it should not have a user account. There are better options, which we're going to talk about. And the reason for this is there's often specific requirements that get applied for us human-based things. For example, mandatory MFA, whereas an application, an automation can't comply with a multi-factor authentication request. So that would be a huge issue. And it's actually one of the problems people are facing right now, that they did use user accounts for automations. And now as Microsoft are rolling out this mandatory MFA, they're panicking because they can't do it. They now need to go and move to what the correct thing was all along. Now we can go and look at our different user accounts. So I'm in the Entra portal. Again, yes, I could go and look at this in Azure. So Azure does have an Entra ID. And yes, there is some basic user things around here, but it's a subset of the functionality. Again, the same for the Office. It's a subset of the functionality. I want to be using the Entra portal. If I'm using automations, I want to be using Microsoft Graph, the Microsoft Graph PowerShell module. If I look at my users, they've got different attributes to them. Now, I can apply filters to this if I wanted to, so I could restrict exactly what I'm seeing at any moment in time. But they have basic properties shown here, things like display name, the user principal name, which contains, in my case, that primary custom DNS. It has a user type. So this is member or guest. Member would be considered someone within my organization, while a guest would be an external identity. And there are differences in some basic rights you have depending on if you're a member or a guest. For example, I can limit what guests can see when they look at the directory compared to members. You'll also notice I have this on-premise sync, and it's showing me no or yes for the various identities. Very often you're going to have Active Directory domain services, and you're going to synchronize your objects from there. You'll also see this identities column, which shows me where the identity originates. So most of them are my tenant, so that's the on Microsoft.name, but some of them are from an external Azure Active Directory. Some of them are from Facebook. I've got other ones down here that would be a phone-based or google.com. So there's different options. I've got some here that's a Microsoft account. So I can bring in these external identities, and you'd seen most of those other ones are going to be guests because they're from somewhere external, but I can make them members if I want to. It's not a direct correlation that if you are an external identity, you have to be a guest. It might be, hey, that person is within my org, they're just in a different tenant, and so I don't want them to be specified as a guest. It's very easy to create new users. I can easily go ahead and just say, hey, I want to create a new user. If I want to do this single one user at a time, there's options to do bulk operations where I could specify a CSV file that had most of the details in. I can hook into HR systems where it could go and via a provisioning agent, let my HR system populate as users get added to the HR system. It calls the Entra provisioning agent, which calls Active Directory and creates the user or just creates it directly in Entra. There's a whole set of different capabilities I can do. But for any of these users, let's pick one. I mean, there's a whole set of different properties. I can go and look at details and I can populate all this different information about them, office locations, job titles. I see the on-premises details. This is replicated from on-prem. So I can see it's in the Justice League OU and Saviltech.net. So I've got all this great information. I can see particular audit logs about the changes to this account. I can see the sign-in log information, the groups, the applications, licenses, Azure role assignments, different authentication methods that are specific to them. So I have huge amounts of information just even about these basic types of entity. So I've got a lot of information here available. We have groups, and groups are something we are commonly going to use, specifically security groups. So if I want to give access to resources or to applications or even grant licenses, I'd rather use a group than directly give access to a particular user. Because what tends to happen, if I give permission to a user, I forget I gave that permission to the user. So as they change roles, they get this ever creeping set of permissions. Whereas if I grant the permission to a group and then users are added and removed to groups, well, their permissions are just based on the groups they're members of. And I can do some really nice things. For example, groups don't have to just be assigned where I'm manually putting people in. One of the great things I can do with groups is I can do something called a dynamic group, where I can specify rules based on the attributes of the user or the device, whatever that might be. And as the attributes change, it will put them in or out of groups. For example, I could have a group membership based on department name. I could have a group membership based on the hire date, for example. And this might be easier to go and see. So if we jump over for a second. So if we look at groups, then sure, I can create a new group and it's going to ask me for the type. So we have also this option of an M365 group that would be useful if I would just want to give permission to maybe like SharePoint and Teams and various things like that. But I'm going to leave it as a security group. And then you can see, is it assigned or dynamic user or dynamic device? So we get these choices that we can make as part of this. Now, if I choose the dynamic, and I'm actually going to jump over and look at some. So we can see the membership type of our groups. You can see it's assigned or dynamic. So I'm going to look for an interesting dynamic one. So I've got one called the Justice League, which is dynamic. Now I can see there are members in it right now. And what's happening here is we have dynamic membership rules. And my rule is super simple. If the job title matches, well, it has to start with heroes, it could be heroine, then they're automatically added into this group. So all of the users you saw in there, their job title is hero or heroine. If they gave up being a hero and their job title was now just, I don't know, mild-mannered reporter, they would fall out of this group. Likewise, I have another one down here. Let's find my other dynamic group. Was it? Dynamic group hire date. So what I've done with this one, if we look at my rule, I'm using the employee hire date attribute, which again could be populated by a HR system. And it has to be greater than or equal to the current time minus 365 days, i.e., anyone whose employee hire date is within the last year is a member of this group. So that gives me this nice ability. So for new joiners, and I don't have any in mind, they would automatically be added to this group, be able to see new joiner resources. But as soon as they're past that new joiner date, well, they would lose that access. Now, I also mentioned this idea that an automation or an application should not use a regular user account. Instead, they should leverage something called a service principal. So in your tenant, this would be an app registration. And that would then have an associated secret. It would have an associated certificate, or I can use a federated credential. And what that would allow me to do is this, whatever this automation is, imagine it lived in GitHub, or imagine it lived in another tenant. Instead of it having to maintain a secret in my tenant, it can be given a token from its tenant and then exchanged for a tenant token from me without having to know anything specific. And so it's just a nice way. So imagine I had a GitHub Actions workflow that was doing deployment of the code I commit, and it wants to go and create an Azure resource. When instead of it having to have a secret for an identity so it can get permission to create Azure resources, it can be given a token from the GitHub identity provider. I create a federation within my tenant that says, hey, it's actually allowed this particular GitHub identity can swap their token for a token from me. And then that identity could be given permission in my Azure subscriptions that trust my tenant. So there's some really cool things you can actually do over here. But if we go and look at our applications and look at an app registration, so I'll just look at all of them. I may even have a Right, GitHub DevOps. So we can see I've got a GitHub Enterprise Cloud, and we have this option of certificates and secrets. So I could add a secret, I could add certificates, I could add a federated credential. It's not, maybe it's this one. I thought I had one of them configured with this. There we go. So this one, you can see it doesn't have a client or a secret, but it's a federated credential. So if I'm a GitHub Actions workflow, specifically, I'm in this repo from that org, and I'm the DevOps Masterclass, and I'm in the test environment, I can actually take a token given to me by GitHub Actions and talk to Entra and swap it out for a token that represents this GitHub DevOps identity that could then be given permissions to stuff in Azure. Now, if you're not doing that, then absolutely you can just create a certificate which would be preferred over a secret, and then your automations, your applications can authenticate as this and then performed various types of actions. So you have those capabilities right there that you can do that. But the whole point here is that I don't want to use a user account because I don't want things like MFA enforced on me. I want that greater sense of flexibility. And you can just go and create these app registrations. You can do it through PowerShell as well. It will create an enterprise app, which is the service principal specific to your tenant. And so you would see those things created as well. Now, additionally, we also have something called a managed identity. Now, this is still a service principal. It's just a special type of service principal. And the way a managed identity works is it's something I can use for Azure resources. So imagine I have one Azure resource that wants to go and interact with another Azure resource. Maybe I'm an automation running an Azure function, and I want to go and talk to a storage account or an Azure SQL database. So I need a permission. Rather than my process running in the function having to go and store some secret or some certificate, a managed identity lets me have this automatic identity created that is tied either to a specific resource or to a group of resources, a user assigned. And then if I'm running inside that identity, that resource, i.e. the Azure function, I can just go and request a token and it will just give it to me because the Azure control plane knows I'm running within that particular resource. So it knows I'm allowed to request a token for that particular managed identity. I get the token, I can go and then use it against other resources where it has permissions given. So if I'm an Azure resource, then I want to use managed identity because now I don't have to store a secret, I don't have to store a certificate or anything like that. And then we have devices. Now, when I think about devices, there's 3 different device states I can have when it comes to Entra. So if I think about, I've got my device. The first state I can have is something called registered. And most of the time here, we're really talking about Windows client devices, so Windows 10 and above, iOS, Android, Mac OS. And with registered, it's a known entity to your Entra tenant. It means I could have things like mobile device management applied to my device, like Intune. But I'm still signing in with a non-Entra account, maybe a Microsoft account, for example. That's good for a bring your own device scenario. Then we can have joined. So joined is really a step above this. This would be good for a corporate-owned device. So with joined, I'm actually signing in with Entra accounts. And then we have the idea of hybrid. In hybrid, it's actually joined to my on-prem Active Directory domain services environment. So it's going to primarily be managed through group policy, but it also gets registered so it's known as part of Entra. So I can get some combination of different capabilities across that. That's one of the nice things we can do. And then there's just other stuff. There's metadata, there's policies that make up really the complete tenant we get in the environment. Now, I guess something important to point out here is most organizations, they do have an Active Directory domain services. So when I think about my users, my groups, I am typically not going to create them directly in Entra. Instead, they're going to be maintained through my Active Directory domain services. So if I look at this picture for a second, what's typically happening for most organizations, if you have Active Directory, you're replicating. So what's happening here, you've got this replication going on of those various options. And Entra is not going to replace Active Directory for most companies. Now, there's a certain motion that for my client devices, there's a modern desktop approach where the desktops will join Entra instead of joining Active Directory. I'll use things like Intune for the management. And that's great, especially for mobile users who work from home. But I'm probably not getting rid of Active Directory, especially for my servers. And also, when I have this replication relationship, what's super important here, Active Directory is the source of truth. The flow is very much that way. The objects, the users, the groups, they're flowing from Active Directory domain servers into Entra. There is some write-back set of capabilities. There's even some group write-back. They're adding some capabilities. So hey, I could create a group up here. And if the user is replicated from AD, I can replicate the group back into my Active Directory so then I can use it there. But primarily, think of the flow as running that way. Now, as mentioned, even though Active Directory is the source of truth, there are a huge number of HR integrations. So imagine you have whatever your HR system is, there's a provisioning service for Entra. And what happens here is you can pick how this works, but I go and create as a new user joining my company, so it's in my HR system. It will talk to the Entra provisioning service. If I have Active Directory, the Entra provisioning service will talk to a provisioning agent, create it in my Active Directory, and then the user would replicate to Entra. If I don't have Active Directory, it will just create it directly in Entra. So this avoids me having these separate operations for joining and leaving, sort of the joiner, mover, leaver sets of scenarios. I can just automate all of that through these provisioning services. And there's provisioning services for specific HR systems, but there's also a provisioning API. So if I use the provisioning API, I could basically hook in from anything. So that's a really nice capability there. Okay. So now we can think about the details of that synchronization. So I mentioned synchronization. So what is that really looked at? As I already said, AD is going to be the source of truth. I'm flowing objects from AD, my users, my groups, primarily from AD to Entra. Little bits of write back are possible. There are some very specific rules around the relationships between Active Directory domain services, the technology I use for the synchronization, and Entra tenants. So an Entra tenant can only sync from one Entra Connect sync instance. So I can have an engine of Entra Connect, and an Entra instance will only talk to one of those. Now, they can also have a second one in the staging for like disaster recovery scenarios, but I'm only going to have one Entra Connect. Now, that Entra Connect could replicate from multiple different domains and even forests, but it will only talk to one of them. That's really a key point. Now, one Active Directory can sync to multiple Entra tenants. Imagine I have an Active Directory and I'm using both commercial and GovCloud, for example. Well, I'd want to be able to populate my user accounts to both of those. So there are now ways that I can sync a single AD to multiple tenants, and I do that by having multiple Connect sync instances. But if I do this, so let's actually have a look at the documentation for a second. Only one of them can do write back. So if we go and look at the documentation, it talks through the legal topologies. And so it talks about, hey, there's one instance here. I can't have multiple connectors talking to one Entra tenant. I could have multiple forests talking through one connect, as we talked about. Again, can't have multiple connects. I can have the one connect instance merging things over. There's this full mesh topology. This is the staging server I talked about. But this is the idea where I could have one AD talking to multiple tenants, but only one of them is allowed to write back. I cannot write back for the others, because that would cause a lot of confusion and really bad things to just happen. So there are some advanced topologies I can do, but I just have to be super careful with how I configure all of the options. Now, when we look at these, so the Entra Connect sync was the original sync solution. And I would have an instance of this Entra Connect sync running on a Windows OS instance. So we can look at it. And the way it would actually work is I would have this instance and it would maintain the idea of connector spaces. There'd be a connector space for my Active Directory. There'd be a connector space for my Entra, and they would merge these objects together in something called a metaverse. And so this would be running in a Windows instance. So I'd have to maintain that. It would have to upgrade that thing. There's an engine running on an instance I have. An alternative is to now use something called the Entra Cloud Sync. With the Entra Cloud Sync, so I have this choice. So I have the Entra Connect, or what I can now use is this idea of Cloud Sync. And with the Cloud Sync, what it does is it runs a very thin provisioning agent on a couple of servers. It could be your domain controllers. Remember, it's doing provisioning tasks. So whatever the security posture of my domain controllers, like these are going to be tier 0 servers, where I put this agent, this provisioning agent used by Entra Cloud Sync, I would want the same tier of security. And again, I can put it on my domain controllers. And this is the same provisioning agent used when I integrate with HR systems. So it's that same agent that would actually go and create objects in AD if HR told the Entra service, hey, there's this new user, Bob. Bob needs an account. Now, there are differences in functionality, but definitely the direction is towards the Cloud Sync. They're really moving. And I think if I go and look at this, it will go through some of those differences. And here we can see. So if you can, you want to try and use the Cloud Sync. One of the nice things about Cloud Sync is it can synchronize from multiple disconnected, they can't talk to each other, AD forests, whereas I can't do that Connect Sync. But there are a few things today Connect Sync does that Cloud Sync doesn't, like pass-through authentication, which we're going to talk about. And you would just go through and look at what you can and can't do to decide what is the right thing. They can coexist. They just can't sync the same objects. So if you want to start moving the things over, you could block certain OUs from Connect Sync and just sync those with Cloud Sync. If I go and look at my environment, for example, under my, I can find it, hybrid management, I've actually retired my Connect Sync. I'm only using Cloud Sync now. So it's just talking to my provisioning agents. You can see if I look at my agents, you'll see I have a machine name here. I've got it running on my domain controller. And you just create configurations of the replication from Entra ID to AD, AD to Entra ID. You can map the different properties. And so you can do all of the various things right there. Okay, so that's the synchronization part. So now what I want to talk about is the idea of authentication and authorization, because there's a huge difference between authentication and authorization. It often gets mixed around, but they are doing very, very different things. So authentication is all about proving I am who I say I am, or proving I'm allowed to use a certain identity. Now, that proof could be something I know, like a password. It could be something I have, like my phone, and by extension, being able to receive a text message or a phone call from it, or a code from an app running on it. Or it could be something I am. I think about a biometric, which could be a fingerprint, a retinal scan, a facial scan. Authorization is what that identity can do on some resource, on some service. It could be certain roles, it could be a certain set of access, but it's about what I can now do. So it's doing very different things. Now, there are various different authentication options available. And when we think of authentication, i.e. that verification of the proof we're given for an identity, there's some that are better than others. Now, for Entra, there are a number of different authentication options. Now, if I just create the account directly in Entra, then its password is going to be stored in Entra. We're going to authenticate always against the cloud authentication against Entra. But when we introduce some external identity system like Active Directory, well, then we get some additional choices. Now, let's just go through what the options are quickly. So there's password hash sync, which means we're going to authenticate against the cloud. We have the option of pass-through authentication, which is really a hybrid type solution. And then we have the idea of federation. So let's quickly dive into, it's probably easier to draw a picture to actually see what's different about these different things that we're actually doing here. So I'm going to give myself lots of space. So we know we have Entra. So I know I have my Entra tenant. And for simplicity, we're also going to say we have the Active Directory. So our Active Directory domain services. Now, in my Active Directory, I have a user account. Now, we don't store the raw password of the user, we store the password hash. Our first thing we want to do, and this is always actually recommended, is we want something called password hash sync. Now, the way password hash sync works is it takes this password hash and then it runs it through its own. So I get a hash of the hash, and this hash of the hash also adds a per user sort to this. And then it runs through 1,000 hashing iterations, which basically is a really fancy way of saying I cannot reverse this. So that I get this hash of the hash, and we're replicating this. So this is password hash sync. So now the user account in Entra has this hash of the hash stored. So now what I could absolutely do is if I was that user, I can authenticate directly against Entra. It doesn't have to talk to Active Directory because it's got this hash of the hash stored. It's a pure cloud authentication. And that's a nice thing because I don't have any reliance on my on-prem Active Directory or communications to my on-prem directory. Even if I opt to use a different type of authentication, which we're about to talk about, you should still do this password hash sync for a number of reasons. There are a number of capabilities in Entra that go and scour the dark web looking for leaked passwords. Well, if it has this hash of the hash, it can go and look for these leaked credentials on the dark web and tell you, hey, this password has been leaked. There's now a user risk. They need to go and change their password. Additionally, imagine I'm using some other authentication method that relies on something external, federation, pass-through, and my network breaks or a system breaks. I can use this as a failback, break the glass authentication if that other type of authentication fails. So this is generally the preferred approach. Now, another approach is, imagine I have my domain controllers. Now, maybe I'm doing something very specific on my directory. Maybe I'm using, for example, time window-based authentications. Maybe I need the ability to have an instant, they can't log in if something happens on this system. So what happens here is I have something called pass-through authentication. So I'm still authenticating against Entra, but when I try and authenticate, what it's basically doing is it's adding an entry to this list of service bus entries waiting for an authentication. I get this agent on the DC which pulls from this, does the authentication. If it's good or bad, it tells it. Assuming it's good, it would then authenticate the user. So that's useful where I have this requirement if I need this zero delay blocking, if I need a feature that Entra doesn't support. So again, the authentication is kind of happening against Entra, but I have a reliance on this as well. So it's more of a hybrid authentication option. The other thing is I can do federation. So with federation, imagine I have some completely separate identity provider, and it could be Active Directory, by the way. And I'm going to create this federated relationship between them. And now what happens is when I say, hey, I want to authenticate against you, actually it's going to redirect me and make me authenticate here. So this is where I authenticate. It will then generate a token and give it to me. And then I give this token to Entra. It would then create an Entra token, which I could then get and then use against resources that trust Entra. So there'd be this relationship. Now, it still will apply things like conditional access policy. Subsequent auths and refreshes will go against Entra. I might use this option if I had some, I don't know, advanced authentication requirements that isn't supported by Entra, but that not supported by Entra is pretty tiny today. Maybe there was some specific types of policy I'm doing. Generally, I don't want the reliance on this external system and federation to be able to authenticate to Entra. So most companies are moving away from this. It's way more common to just use this password hash sync. It's way more common to use the federation capabilities of Entra to third-party applications. But those are the options that you do have available to you. And as I'm really making, I think, pretty obvious here, generally it's recommended in that order. Use password hash sync. Hey, if there's really something super specific, you could use pass-through authentication, but you really don't want that federation these days. All of these methods, I can get a very nice, seamless experience. So I have my account, for example, I'm in Active Directory. When I go and try and access some resource that trusts Entra, I will get a really great, I'm not going to get prompted for authentication again. They all give me a very nice either single sign-on, federation, or seamless sign-on through that password hash sync type capability. There's a nice document that walks through the details of all of these. So it's got like a decision tree on this. So if you're not sure the relative pros and cons of it, obviously it's linked in the documentation for this course, but it talks through the different options. There's a nice little decision tree over here that might help you make up your mind. But again, for most people, for most companies, you really are just going to use that password hash sync. It is probably the way to go. Okay, so moving on. Roles and administrative units. I've mentioned roles before, but now it's time to look at them in a little bit more detail. Specifically, I'm talking about roles here that are related to Entra and also some of the Microsoft software as a service solutions like M365 and Dynamics 365. These are separate from Azure Resource Manager roles. They are treated very, very differently. Some of the capabilities are very, very different. And we're going to talk about that in the Azure. When we talk about Azure governance and Azure permissions, we'll go into the Azure Resource Manager model. So here we're really just talking about the things that are built into Entra. And really the goal here is there's a whole bunch of these just built into Entra. We go and have a look quickly. So if I go back, let's exit all of these. If I'm just in my identity area and I go to my roles and actions, there's a whole bunch of roles. And you'll see straight away, so there's roles around AI, so things about M365 Copilot. There are roles, yes, that are specific to Entra itself. There are roles that you'll see around Exchange, Dynamics 365. So there's all these different roles. And really, these roles just have different sets of permissions. So, for example, and a role you always want to be careful of is the global administrator. This is the all-powerful account. And you'll even see it flags these as something called privileged. So if it's privileged, it contains some permission that could be misused, that can do elevation things. You want to be super careful about who you actually give that type of permission to. And so if I look at one of these and look at the description, it shows me the exact permissions that it has. So it's just made up of one or more different permissions you have. Now, something I alluded to earlier is the idea that, okay, there are many built-in roles, great. Roles can be given to users and a specific type of group. And that goes a little bit against what I said earlier. What I said earlier is, hey, we want to give things to groups, not directly to users. In Entra, by default, I actually can only grant roles to users. If I want to be able to give it to a group, I have to grant it to a very specific type of group. So if we go and look at our groups for a second, when I create a group, you'll notice Entra roles can be assigned to the group. As soon as I say yes, the membership type is grayed out. It has to be assigned. It cannot be a dynamic rule anymore. But now what can happen is this cloud groups is not replicating from Active Directory. I have to manually put people in it. It can't be dynamic. Now this can be granted Entra roles. So it has to be this very specific type of group to be able to accept Entra roles. So that's super specific. Now, if the roles we have are not sufficient, remember we think just enough, we want the minimum possible set of permissions, I can create my own role. So I can go and create a new role. I can create it from scratch, or I can clone it from an existing role and then modify it accordingly. But I would set all the permissions I want it to have, and now I could go and give that to someone. Now the challenge here is I can only have up to 100 of those custom roles per tenant. So yes, I can create custom roles. Yes, I want just enough, the minimum set of possible permissions. So maybe the roles that are built in, there's too many, but realize there's only a finite number of those I can actually create. Now remember, our goal is to always think least privilege. I want to give the minimum possible set of permissions I can at the minimum possible scope I can. Normally, when we assign a role, it is for the entire tenant. I'm granting it for everything. So if we look at this for a second, so we have our Entra tenant. I'm going to be joining the Entra tenant a lot. So we have our Entra tenant. Remember, we have a role, which is just a set of permissions. And we're now going to assign that role to a user or that special cloud type group. And normally, the scope of this assignment is the entire tenant. That's the permissions. I grant that role, every single object that falls within that permission is tenant-wide. I can do it across all of them. But I may not want that. Imagine the scenario that I have a branch office, for example, and I would like the office administrator of that office to be able to reset the users just for that particular office. I don't want them to be able to do it for the whole company, so I don't want to give them like a help desk admin capability. So one of the nice things we can do here is we have the option, so instead of the scope being the whole tenant, one of the things I can do here is I can assign it instead to something called an administrative, can't spell at all, administrative unit. An administrative unit, I can put users in it, I can put groups in it, I can put devices in it. And now the scope could instead be an administrative unit. So I'm granting the role to some identity, but instead of it being tenant-wide, it would only be to the users, groups, or devices that I put in this specific administrative unit. Now, something to be super cautious around here. Not all roles are available. The membership can be dynamic or assigned, just like we could do with groups, but it limits it. But if I add a group into an administrative unit, it is not including the users in the group. And that's deliberately. What this means is, so if I add a group into this admin unit, I can manage the group properties, but I don't get management of the users in the group. Because imagine the scenario, if I wanted to do something bad, I could add a user into this group, and now I'd have management of that person. I have to explicitly add the users in to be a member to be able to manage the users. So that's a very, very deliberate thing that I have to be able to do. So we can go and look at this. So if I jump over, notice it's under my roles and admin section. I get this idea of admin units. So I've created a number of different admin units. I've got Gotham users, and mine is actually a dynamic membership role. So it's the user city equals Gotham. So if the property of the user is Gotham, they automatically get given access to this. And now I can grant a role only to the people here. So I maybe could give it, you can see the different options here. So it could be a help desk administrator, for example. So help desk administrator, I've given to Alfred. So Alfred could go and reset passwords, for example, and do basic things for the people in Gotham. But Alfred couldn't do it for anyone not in this particular administrative unit. So we have this really nice ability to go and create these. So that's a way of being way more specific in my environment. Now, to create administrative units, I have to be a global administrator or a privileged role administrator. I also need a P1 license if I'm doing administrative work on an admin unit. I don't need a P1 license if I'm in an administrative unit. I can't nest administrative units. They can't be used to give permission to resources. You use regular groups for that. Now, administrative units are great in that they can give additional people permission to manage the members of an administrative unit in addition to the regular tenant-wide people who have permissions. But there's also something called a restricted management administrative unit. So this is the scenario where consider maybe what I actually have now is my CEOs, my really important people or maybe devices, where there are people that need to be able to manage those objects, but I don't want the regular tenant-wide people to be able to do administrative actions on them. So what I can do here is I can now create a restricted management. administrative unit, I put those really important people or devices, so the CEO, John, within there. And now what happens is I grant this role, the scope could be this particular delegated restricted management administrative unit, but the people who have a role at the tenant do not have the ability to perform that management, even global admins. Now, if I say things like global admins can't manage these objects, they can't by default. If I'm a global admin, I'm basically a super user, remember? I'm a global admin. I could modify the AU to add myself to have a role with the admin unit, and then I could go and do the things. It's always like the old domain admin argument. How do I protect something from a domain admin? You can't. This would be, there'd be an audit log that said how the global admin added themselves to the admin unit to do those things. But this would more be useful for, hey, the regular help desk admins. I don't want them messing with these super important objects. I could leverage it for that type of capability. But this is, again, useful for those more locked down type scenarios. So here you can see in the admins unit, when I add one, it says, is this a restricted management administrative unit? And I think I've got one. Yeah, I've got one here, my executive users. And Bruce Wayne is in there. And then I would go and set who has particular roles over just this. So I now would have those abilities to go and limit that down. And again, there's full logging of everything that's happening across all of these. Now, most of the time, you're going to be using this. Maybe it's a boss that has some capability over the people that work for them. Maybe it's, again, that help desk scenario for remote office. There's a special site, mystaff.microsoft.com. It's a very simple interface, but it's actually not bad. I'll only see the administrative units I have permission on, but it would let me go and I can see all of them because I'm all powerful. But hey, I could go in, I would just see this very simple experience, and I could do basic things. So this would be a site I could give to maybe like those local help desk admins, etc., where they don't need the full or couldn't use the full Entra experience. It would just be beyond their capabilities. So now I want to talk about privileged identity management. We talked about just enough permissions, only having the minimum rights you need to do a job. But we also talk about just in time. We only get the permission when we need it. And one of the nice things we can do with privileged identity management is it lets us elevate up for an Entra role or an Azure Resource Manager role when I need it for a finite amount of time. I can do things like require strong authentication. I can hook into conditional access policies through an authentication context. It's also integrated for Azure in the Azure portal identity and access management experience, which is a really nice capability. And I can also elevate up to group memberships or elevate up to own a group if I require it. I can require a justification as to why I'm elevating. I can require a manager to approve it. I can require a ticket to be associated with it. Again, I can link it to an authentication context, so I could require a certain conditional access policy to be met, which could be a compliant device, a SOAR workstation. I've done a passkey phishing resistant authentication. I can do all of those different things, but I must pre-assign it to a user. It's not ad hoc. I, in advance, have said this user is allowed to elevate up to this role in Entra or this role in Azure or be a member of this group because maybe that group's been assigned a certain permission whenever they need to use it. And the users can elevate on demand or they can set it to elevate at a future time. This is an Azure AD P2 feature. So, as always, if we go and have a quick look. So it's under my identity governance. and I see my option of privileged identity management. Now remember, there are different types of privileged identity management based on Entra roles, or is it based on an Azure role? So when I'm doing Entra roles, I can go in here and I could look at the roles I have. I could manage settings. So if I do settings, I can go and configure what are the options for each of the Entra roles, for example. So I might say, okay, security operator. If I edit, I can say when you activate, what's the maximum duration you're allowed to activate for? Do I require particular MFA, or do I require you to meet an authentication context? And again, an authentication context is really just a label in a lot of ways. I'll deviate slightly for a second. So if I look at my protection and conditional access, I can create an authentication context, which again is just a label. It gets an ID. But then what I can do is when I have those authentication contexts, I've got two. When I create a conditional access policy, when we talk about what is it targeting, I can tell it to actually target a specific authentication context. And then I can put in all the requirements. So I could say, hey, I need a certain authentication strength. I need a compliant device, blah, blah, blah. And then typically the authentication context, I would link to sensitive data. But in this case, I could link it to PIM. So to do this certain elevation, you require maybe a stronger authentication. I don't trust just vanilla MFA. So I could go and configure those types of options. So I could configure all of the details, how long, what's required. Do I require them to enter a justification? Do I require a ticket? Do I require approval from some approver before I can elevate up? And I can go and do that for all of the different options. I can say, can it be permanently assigned? How the activation, I have full control of every aspect of this. And then I can actually go and assign them. So I can grant assignments to people. When I add the assignment, I would just select the role and then who I'm assigning it to. I'm just going to select anything here. And then I'll say, is it eligible? So they have to actually elevate up. Or if it's active, they've just got it. They don't have to elevate up to use it. And I can say, is it permanently eligible, or they're only eligible for a certain finite period of time. So I would go and do those various things. If it's for a group, I can go and specify the group I want them to be able to elevate up to, be a member of, or manage. For Azure resources, I have to pick the scope first. So a management group or a subscription or even a particular resource group. Once I select the scope, then I can go and do the same thing. I can specify the settings for all of the roles that I could use, and I could then go and do the various assignments for that exactly the same way. It is integrated with the Azure experience for management group subscriptions and resource groups. So if I was to just pick any resource group and I go to the Internet and Access Management, if I add a role assignment, really the bit we're paying attention to now is you get this assignment type option, and I can set it as eligible instead of active. And then I can set time durations. I can link it to particular PIM policies. So it's really nice that it's now really encouraging me to go and use that nice superior experience. And the end result is, as a user, if I can find the right window over here. So I'm now logged on as Clark. If I go to my PIM experience and look at my Entra roles, I can see what I'm eligible for, and I can go and activate. I can elevate up for a certain period of time based on what those maximums are. It's wanting me to do a strong authentication. So I've done the strong authentication. I could set an activation start time in the future, I have to add a reason, and I would just activate up. And so that's a way that I would then go and consume that. So that's the point of PIM. It gives me the ability that I can get the roles only when I actually need to do it. It's not just sitting there all the time, which is obviously a much better option to have. So moving on, we also have Entra Permissions Management. Now, this is actually more of an on-demand ad hoc capability. Whereas with PIM, remember, I configure it in advance. This is ad hoc. I don't have to have been assigned the permissions in advance. This was actually an acquisition. This was a CloudKnox acquisition. I just need the permission now. Now, it gives me very granular permissions. I don't have to just select roles. I can say I need this particular permission. It does work across clouds. So it's Azure, it's AWS, it's GCP. I need particular permissions to onboard the cloud to the solution. But then, right, I get this very nice, completely ad hoc set of capabilities. Another big thing it does is about right sizing of permissions. So it will look at the roles identities have, it will look at the permissions they're using, and it can say, hey, you've not used this permission for 90 days, we should remove it. It could say, actually, we recommend this custom role with a restricted set of permissions based on what you're doing. So it will help you get that minimum possible set of permissions you really need to do the jobs you're doing. This is a separate license. So this is a more advanced capability, but it's there, so it's good to know it exists if ever you needed it. Then we get to access reviews. And this is a huge capability because historically, as we've talked about, you get this constant creep of permissions over time. As you change roles, you get added to this, added to this, added to this. Very rarely do you get removed from something. So this is all about the ability to perform an access review on, it could be group memberships. So I keep getting added to groups, never removed. App assignments, role assignments, Entra and Azure Resource Manager, and access package assignments. And these can be performed by administrators, specific people, or even I can do a self-review. I can ask people, hey, go and do this. Can you go and confirm you still need these sets of permissions? So it's actually a really nice thing to help control these constantly elevating sets of permissions. So here under my identity governance, I've got access reviews. So from here, I've got I can do a new access review. And what I can target is teams and groups and applications. So that's where I can go and see those capabilities just for the teams and groups. So I have that right there. If I want to look at, let's go to PIM. If I go to Entra roles, now I get the ability to create an access review for roles, for Entra roles. So I'm doing it via PIM. If I'm in PIM, but I go and look at Azure resources, I'll just pick a subscription again. Now I could create an access review for permissions given to the Azure resource. So the place I'm doing these things does vary, but it gives me the ability to, hey, go and have those access reviews, and I can make it recurring, so they have to constantly go and redo the things. I could do it as a one-off, but it's just a great way to go and validate, hey, do you still need these particular sets of permissions? The licensing, some of it is part of P2. Some of them is actually part of an enhanced governance license, which would be included as part of the Entra Suite license. So you'd want to go and look at the particular type of access reviews you're going to do to know the exact license you require. So now I want to talk about multi-factor authentication, and we're really moving beyond just MFA and starting to talk about strong authentication, because they do mean different things, and there's different susceptibilities to people trying to trick you to do bad things with them. Now, it's pretty well understood at this point that passwords on their own are bad. We don't like passwords on them. They make us very sad. Now, there are things we can do just around basic passwords. If we look at Entra, for example, one of the things I can do in Entra, let me close all these windows down. Get all these windows build up over time. Oh, didn't mean to do that. If I go as part of my Entra, I look at my protection, one of the things I have is the idea of authentication methods. So I go to my authentication methods, and we have this concept of password protection. So this has smart lockout. So smart lockout tries to protect a genuine user being locked out by some bad actors spamming the account with bad passwords to try and lock them out. So it's smart enough to not allow that, and it has this constantly escalating period of lockout. And again, it understands the different locations where auths are coming from to try and distinguish between a good and a bad actor. I can also enforce protection from silly, easy to guess passwords. I could add my own custom sets of passwords and anything that derives from that password. So swapping an O for a 0, for example. I can even use these against Active Directory. There's a little on-prem agent I can use to help protect me and enforce those. So even basic passwords, yes, there are things to help protect me. But what they've found is that, yes, we have protections from the passwords, but even basic MFA blocks 99.2%, I think it's the latest number, of most types of attacks. Now, when I think about, well, what is MFA? MFA is something we know, a password, a PIN, a certain gesture. It's something we are, a biometric, or it's something we have, like a phone or a token. And when we say the term MFA, it's two or more of them. So if I go back to where did my picture go? Okay, so I'm doing my authentication here. So I've got my authent. So remember, if I think about what is that authentication, my authentication is one of those things. So it's saying I know, saying I have, or something I am. And for MFA, it's two or more of them. That's the key point of that. And as we talked about already, there's different levels. We have a password alone. And a password on its own really just makes us sad. We don't like that. We don't want a password on its own at all. So the next level would be, okay, it's a password and it's an SMS, a text message, or it's a phone call. This is better than just a password, but it's not fantastic. There are obviously types of attack where I can clone SIMs. There's some kind of target attack. It's not going to be your average attacker, but if I'm maybe the target of an attack, they're prone to those types of attack, and it's not ideal. So then we get into the idea of, well, instead of an SMS or a phone call, we have something like an authenticator app. Or there's some kind of time-based one-time passcode. This could be a physical kind of token. It could be the application, like the Authenticator app, to use that. And that's a lot better. Like that makes us happy. And one of the things I'll show you in a second, like we have controls over the types of experience we'll get when we use that. So if we jumped over for a second, and if we think about our authentication methods for a second over here, and I just go and look at the different policies we have. So we have the Microsoft Authenticator app and do configure. I have control. of, well, does it make them match a number? Does it show the actual application name? Does it show the geographical location? So there's things we can do to enhance awareness of the user that's getting this prompt to make it a better experience for them. When I use things like the Authenticator app, it acts as a token broker. So if I have multiple apps on that phone, they'll get a single sign-in set of capabilities. But then we get the concept and the idea that there's no password. So this could be again, the Authenticator app can do this, but it's things like hello for business. So that's on our PC. We have certificate-based authentication. And then we have FIDO2 passkeys. Now you're hearing the term passkey a lot at the moment. And these we love. We're like, yay, we're so happy, we're delirious, because we don't want the password. As much as possible, we want to get rid of it. And realize, you might look at these and think, why are these strong authentication? Why are these MFA if there's no password? To use hello for business, it's the TPM in our machine. So it's saying I have, and there's a PIN or a biometric gesture to complete the authentication. PIN is saying I know. Biometric gesture is saying I am. If I'm using a passkey, well, that's maybe on my phone, or FIDO2 is a USB key. It's saying I have, and again, I have to unlock it. It's biometric or a PIN. And a passkey is even better because it requires proximity. And so these are all strong authentications. And the whole point about what we're seeing right now is for these bottom three, these are phishing resistant. I can't be tricked into authenticating a bad remote actor because they're either in the device, they're attached to the device, or they require a proximity to the device performing the authentication on. I can't be tricked to do some remote machine because there's no way that that presence would actually be there. Now, when I just think about regular MFA, be careful with how you use this. If you made people constantly MFA all the time, they get MFA fatigue. The recommendation is use risk. So if you detect heightened risk, then make them do an MFA. Now, if I'm using passkeys though, or hello for business, it's not a negative user experience. And so you can just always do those strong authentications. They've just got that by default. It's just there for them, which is another reason these passkeys are being pushed. The FIDO2, it's the same standard. A passkey in some ways is another term for the FIDO2, but it adds requirements around that proximity as well to actually complete it. And if you've just never seen it, I'll jump on the slide for a second. I mean, this is what the Authenticator app does. So I want to authenticate. It will show me a number. I have to type the number in, but it's also showing me, well, what's the app trying to do it, and where is that request actually coming from? So a user can't just muscle memory click yes. They would have to know that particular number that's being prompted for, and they can get that context. Now, you might wonder, why is this not considered phishing resistant? Realize what is happening here, though. I have to type in a number on that, but I could still be tricked. A bad actor could still say, oh, hi, I'm from your help desk. We've detected some unusual activity. Now, I'm going to send you a test to prove you really are who you say you are. And then they say 73 or whatever that number, and I'm like, oh, 73. You've authenticated. So they've tricked you into authenticating. So the Auth app is not phishing resistant for that basic authentication. Whereas, again, all of these others require an actual proximity between the device performing that strong authentication and the device that actually wants the auth. So I can't be tricked to go and authenticate someone hundreds and hundreds of miles away. There's no way I can actually do that. So that's really one of the key points about why we like the phishing resistant capabilities that add in that proximity type set of requirements. And Entra actually has all of these. So if you go and look for a second, actually, so if I come out of this, you'll actually notice they have the concept of authentication strengths. And this is what I can select instead of just MFA as part of conditional access policies. It's got a number built in. So there's regular MFA, which is Hello for Business and 16 more. There's Authenticator app MFA, which is something I created. There's passwordless MFA, and there's phishing resistant MFA. Now, if we look at the passwordless MFA, it's Hello for Business, passkeys, certificate-based authentication, and the Microsoft Authenticator app. If we look at phishing resistant, doesn't list the Authenticator app, which is the key point. So if I want to give my users the maximum protection, I want to use one of these authentication strengths. And in our conditional access policies, we can just select that authentication strength as part of our grant. So instead of requiring multi-factor authentication, we instead require authentication strength, and then it will give us a list of all the ones. And you can add your own custom ones, and I can require one of those. So that's a lot better for your more sensitive apps that I don't particularly want to trust an SMS text, for example. No, I want it to be a strong authentication. And so I could select the auth strength instead. Okay. So there are extra MFA features available. So for Entra P1, I get all of those different MFA options for me. If I don't have P1 licensing, I can use security defaults, which give me some additional capabilities. If I'm a global admin, it again adds to those options. Now, in 2024, Microsoft started to roll out mandatory MFA. So if you actually go and look at what Microsoft are doing here, they're rolling out, and it's got the timeline where MFA is going to be required. So the Azure portal, Entra Admin Center, but it's expanding into things like PowerShell, the CLI, infrastructure as code tools. And this is what I was talking about. So if you, instead of using a service principal for your automation, just used a regular user account, and now they're pushing these required MFA, you're in a world of hurt because you have no way of doing an MFA for an automation. So now you're completely stuck. It's why you need to use service principals so you don't get human type MFA requirements enforced on you. That's really a huge point. And as we just showed, conditional access can require specific strengths of protection. Now, this is all well and good. I want these strong authentication strengths. But how do I secure the initial registration? Now, strong authentication and self-service password reset, while they have slightly different methods available, they've been merged into a single process to actually do the onboarding. I can go to aka.ms SSPR setup, and it will walk me through that as part of the My Account experience and its security info. I can create registration campaigns to drive things like the authentication methods that I have available to me. But there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem because to go and onboard to this strong authentication, I have to authenticate. And to authenticate, I'd have to use a password, which on its own is weak, but I'm using a weak authentication to onboard to the strong authentication. That's not a good place I want to be. Now, one thing I can do, if I am rolling out passwordless technologies and I don't want the user to even really know what the password on the account is, it's just some random gobbledygook, one really great thing we have is something called a temporary access pass. This is a one or limited use code that's time limited as well, that can be generated for a user, shared with them offline, and they can use it just to perform that initial authentication to onboard to passwordless technologies, and then they're only living in a passwordless world. So if I, for example, if I go and look at those authentication methods again, we can see one of them is temporary access pass. And if I go and look at the configuration, mine is maximum lifetime is 8 hours. It's not one-time use, and it's 8 characters. And I could change that if I wanted to. But now all I have to do is, let's say I've got my new user joining. Maybe I'm their help desk, or I'm part of the onboarding solution. Hey, it's Barry Allen. I can just go to their authentication methods. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new authentication method. It's going to be a temporary access pass. Maybe they're joining, they're going to be onboarding on Monday morning, so I could set it a delayed start time. I set the duration it's good for. I think mine is set to 1 hour maximum. I'm not going to make it one-time use, so maybe they do something wrong the first time, so they can use it for that 1 hour. And I'll just do add. It's going to tell me, so I would now need to take note of this, give it to Barry, say use this at this site with your username to authenticate and onboard the authenticator cat. Onboard a passkey, and then an hour, it's going to be useless, and I'm done. And if they're finished with it early, I could just go and delete it. So this is a really nice capability to do some of that just basic onboarding. And I don't want to give the user a regular password. They're all random gobbledygook. I don't do those. But even then, maybe I want them to come on site initially. One of the great things we can do is I can use conditional access user actions to lock down where I can perform that set of ability. So I can create a particular conditional access policy. So I'll go to my protection. If I can find it, I've got too many things going on now. And if I create a new policy, one of the things I can target is user actions. And I'm going to target registering security information. And then what I could do is, well, maybe to do this registering of security informations, maybe I require them to be on a compliant device. Maybe I require them to be in a certain location. So they have to come on site maybe to be able to do those things. But I can add levels of protection to what is a fairly sensitive type operation. And I don't want it just happening from anywhere around. And also, if you do forget your password, there's a nice site you can go to go and reset it. And because they've registered for that self-service password reset, again, if they're using passwords, but we tend to be pushing more and more to the password list, they could go there and reset it. So conditional access. I think this is the biggest feature of Entra. It can apply protection to everything. It's the policy engine. Every app I access, every service I access, this can get called and evaluates any policies that I have defined. And it's triggered for any authorization, regardless of what authentication methods I'm using. And it provides very rich controls around the users, the roles, the apps, the environment that I may want to use as really part of anything I'm doing here. And this is, to use it, it is an Entra P1 license. And just before we go into, and I'll show you conditional access policy, just to make sure you understand that token. Now, you don't need to know this in huge amounts of detail. This is not like, I have to understand the details of tokens. You don't. But consider that I have Entra. Consider you have the user. or the app the user's using. So this is the client. And then consider I have the app that I want to consume. When I want to use this, hey, I want to go and consume this resource. What happens is it says, hey, well, I need a token, so I want to leverage it. I'd like access, please. And it says, well, I need a token from Entra. So I then go and perform an authentication. I have to prove, if I haven't already, maybe I've already authenticated to Entra. But if I haven't, I have to authenticate. And then I'm performing an authorization for this particular application. Now, assuming I pass that, and at this point, every time I want a token, it is applying conditional access policies every single time. Everything I'm doing here surrounds Entra and is going to require conditional access to be evaluated. Assuming I pass the requirements for this app, which can have its own particular conditional access policies, it's going to generate an access token that's time limited, between 60 and 90 minutes of 75-minute average. So they're short-lived, and they're short-lived because historically, I can't cancel it. Once you have an access token, it's good. There's no way to revoke it. Now, there is a technology called continuous access evaluation that enables supporting apps to understand things like location policies. It lets them sign up for things like revocation events so they could know if something critical has happened and then cancel the use of the token. It can send them a challenge that they have to meet by going and talking back to Entra. There's only specific apps today. It's mostly Microsoft apps. So these are generally very, very short-lived tokens because we can't revoke them. So this is very much time limited. So that's 60 to 90 minutes. But the refresh token can then be used to go and request a token again. So I get these sent to me, and then I get that access token, and I send it to the app. I'm all good and happy. 60 to 90 minutes later has elapsed. It won't accept the access token anymore. I take my refresh token. I send it back to Entra. It will recheck conditional access policies. It will create me a new access token and an updated refresh token. So it's always rolling validity. Sends it to me. I send my new access token and continue using the app. If I'm using the Microsoft Authentication library, if I'm using like the Authenticator app, it's doing all of this for me. I am not having to manually worry about these tokens. But my point here, conditional access is always coming into play no matter what I'm doing. Now, if we go and look at conditional access, so I've been playing around with policies right here. You've kind of seen some of this. There are actually elements, we can have terms of use. It's just a PDF document. So I could require them to accept a document, for example. And there's different things I can do with this. I can have things like named locations, which are geo-based or IP-based, if I want to restrict based on certain locations. But then we just have our policies. And when we create a policy, we give it a name. I assign it to particular users or all users. I can assign it to particular roles. I can assign it to particular users, particular groups. I could target only guests. So again, there's that differentiation there. I could exclude certain roles. I can target particular cloud applications. I could target, so here I could select a particular cloud app that's known to my Entra tenant that I want to hit with a particular type of policy or sets of requirements. So all those lists. As we talked about, I could target particular authentication contexts that I would then go and link to particular data, particular actions. I've got huge capabilities here. We'll even see it linked to things like internet sites, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. I can configure network requirements. I can set based on risk. Now, risk is a P2 feature, but it can base on all of the signals it's seeing: impossible travel, leaked credentials, unknown locations. So user risk is online and offline signals. Sign-in risk is this particular sign in and if it's likely compromised. Insider risk is information from Purview. I can target platforms, locations, apps. I could filter for attributes on devices like a SAW. I can hook into authentication flows. And then we have the controls. Block access, grant access, require MFA, require an authentication strength, make it compliant, make them accept the terms of use, make them change their password, like all these great capabilities. And I can even do session controls, limit the amount of time that they can stay signed in for. Customize continuous access evaluation. You want to be careful with those things. But I have full control at a super granular level. Now, when you start out, make sure it runs in report only. See what the impact is, understand what's happening, and then once you're confident it's not going to break the world, then you can set it to on and it would actually be enforced. So that's just a good kind of use when you think about leveraging these things. And I've got everything I've talked about in this video, I've got deeper dive videos on. I'm obviously going pretty fast just because there's so many different things to cover when you talk about identity within an environment. Okay, so the next thing is B2B, business to business, and your customers. Now, this actually all kind of comes under this external ID brand now, but I'm keeping B2B and external ID a little bit separate just for how we talk about it. It makes some of the things a little bit simpler. Now, imagine the scenario that I, as a company, have people I want to collaborate with. Now, these are my partners. These are not my customers. These are partners that maybe I want to work together on a SharePoint site with, on my Azure resources with. I'm working with them. I can invite them to my Entra tenant as a B2B external identity. They already have an account in their company, and they don't want to have a completely separate account for my company. That's a horrible experience for everyone. It's a horrible experience for them because there's now another account they have to manage and remember passwords for. It's horrible for my company because they're going to forget that password, and my help desk will have to manage working with them and resetting passwords. It's objects to manage. And it's horrible for their company because they don't have any control of the account their person's using against resources we're partnered with. So it's horrible for everyone. So instead, what we want is for them to be able to use their existing account. So the way I would think about this is we have our tenant. So this is our particular tenant where our particular applications and our particular resources trust. Our SharePoint sites, our teams, our Azure resources, our third-party SaaS apps. And I've got all my users in here. But now what's happening, I've got my partner. Again, not my customers. Now remember, my partner, they might have their own Entra tenant. They might use a Microsoft consumer account. They might have a Gmail account, Google. They might have Facebook. They might use some custom SAML or WS Fed or OpenID Connect, whatever that might be. We're adding that as a business to business, an external ID into our tenant. I can send them an email that they would then redeem. So they get an invitation, they redeem the email, or I can actually set up a self-service sign-up based on the organization where they could come and automatically get signed up for things in my company. Now, when I do this, realize the partners, the authentication is happening against their tenant. They don't have to have any kind of auth against me. But the authorization is still against my tenant. So my conditional access policies are running, my requirement for strong authentication. Now, we'll see this in a second. I can configure certain trust settings so that, for example, they've done a strong auth here, or they've got a compliant device here can be sent and made available to me so that I would use this. But ordinarily, without that, they would have to have their own MFA configured against my tenant. Then there is also something called a one-time passcode. Imagine I have a partner who doesn't have any of these. What they can do is every time they want to authenticate, I'll email them a passcode that proves they still have access to that mailbox. In that case, the authentication is happening against mine tenant. So that's kind of the exception if I use the one-time passcode. We don't typically use that. That would only be if they don't have one of these other things they could already use. And if we go and look, well, there's a number of things we can actually look at as part of this. If we just go and look at our users for a second, well, firstly, as part of their name, if they're from somewhere else, we see it's got this hash, ext hash. And obviously, this is from yahoo.com. So this is probably going to be an email. So I'm mailing them this one-time passcode. I can see this is from an external Azure AD. So I can see, well, that's actually their tenant is over there. I got something from Facebook over here. So that's a Facebook identity. There's other external Azure ADs. There's a Microsoft account over here doing something. There's a Google. One of them is using a phone-based authentication. So there's different things I can do. But they appear as an entity in my tenant, but their still actual account lives somewhere else. Now, I do have control around a lot of the aspects of this. I mean, there's different identity providers. I do have control of that. If I actually go and look, so here I can see my external identities. I can see the identity providers supported. So here we can see it's a Entra, one-time passcodes, Microsoft, Google, Facebook. And again, I could go and add custom ones, such as SAML, WSFed, if I wanted to go and actually add something else that I could use within here. So I do have control of exactly what I'm doing here. Now, one of the nice things we can do is there's general settings that we just have, but I also have this ability to do cross-tenant access settings to give me more control over particular people I want to be able to accept guests from, or for my users to be guests of, and also exactly what I want to trust in terms of, hey, you've done a strong authentication or you haven't done a strong authentication. So while we're looking here, well, firstly, there's a more general external collaboration settings, which is right here. And that would just let me configure, I could allow or block certain domains. I can say, well, hey, if you're a guest, I'm limiting access to certain things, so I have controls around those. But in the cross-tenant access settings, I can set organizational defaults for what we allow. But I can then, for particular organizations, override both the inbound and outbound access. So if I look at my inbound access, for example, one of the things I have here is trust settings. And I could say, hey, I want to trust the MFA authentication. I want to trust compliant devices. I want to trust hybrid join devices. I can do things around redemption. If this was a tenant that was actually owned by my company, I can even set up some cross-tenant sync, which will automatically populate the users as external IDs within my tenant to simplify having to manually go and add them. So that's a really nice capability that we can do as part of this. The licensing is very different than it used to be. It used to depend on the number of licenses I had for my users, and there was a ratio. It doesn't do that anymore. We have a new model. You just have 50,000 free that can use all the P1, P2 features. After that, you build based on the features they're leveraging, based on if they're doing MFA, and then what country they're coming from, if it's from like a phone or a text. So it's based on monthly active users, I'm an active user within a particular month. And I can just link that billing to a certain subscription. And then we have the idea of our customers. Now, there's still a B2C, which was the previous experience, but it's really evolved now to a more complete customer identity and access management SIAM solution. So it takes what B2C was doing, and now I have this more combined experience with regular workforce tenants. These are now an external tenant. So it's trying to unify the capabilities. It's the same licensing as a B2B external ID, but now we create this separate external tenant. So if this is our partners, now we have the concept of our customers. And again, they have their own identities, some social identity. I create a very specific external type of tenant that lets me do some more customization, more flows that I want to be able to do. And they would link their social identities into here, or they could create a local account if they don't have one. So we don't want customers in here, and my customer-facing apps would trust this tenant. So I treat it as a very different set of capabilities than what we would have with our works. And we can see these if I jump back over for a second. If I look at my overview and manage my tenants, most of mine are workforce. I did just set up an external one. So if I look at the external tenant, we'll actually switch to it quickly. If I now go and look at the providers supported here, this is more in line with a regular workforce tenant. Really, the difference here is they've added Apple, which is obviously very common. So most consumers are going to have a Microsoft account, a Google, a Facebook, or an Apple account. But it's very similar to a regular workforce Entra tenant. Whereas if I look at the old B2C tenant, there we go, it had a wider range of support for more identity providers, and these may come into this new external type tenant over time. But if we go and look at all identity providers here, it's a much bigger list. It was all of these type things. So I think we'll probably see more come over time. But this external tenant is the new direction. So external ID is the new path and really what's going to be used now when you have the requirement to have identities for your customers. You're going to use external ID. That's definitely the future direction. B2C still exists. Those licensing still exists, but you definitely don't want customers in your corporate tenant. You want them somewhere else with more user flows, more abilities to onboard and everything else. Really starting to wrap up. We do have entitlement management and workflows. The goal here is I can create access packages. Now, this is a P2 feature, and then there's some additional things as well. But I can package up things like group memberships, applications, SharePoint sites, and Entra roles. And then I can define policies for who can go and request those, how they can go and sign up. And that could also go and add them as guests to my Entra tenant. I create the policies to drive that, how many stages of approval they might need, who is allow listed and can just come straight into that. Then we also have lifecycle workflows. So that's really useful when I want to automate tasks related to that joiner, mover, leaver type scenario. So as someone's joining, go and perform these various actions on the tenant to really automate that complete experience. So if we go and look at mine, and now we're looking at identity governance. So entitlement management is where we go and create these access packages of all those things that I just talked about. But then we have things like lifecycle workflows. So I can create specific workflows, so like a pre-hire employee. And we can say, well, when it triggers for the user, what are the tasks it's going to do? If I do add tasks, You can see the types of things you could do. Add a user to group, disable the account, enable the account, remove the user, generate a tap. So, hey, they're about to join, create a temporary access pass and send it to maybe their private email address. Send welcome email, delete user account, remove user. So it's all about that joiner leaver type scenarios that I can automate based on things like their onboarding and offline and offboarding dates they have as part of their identity. So that complete life cycle of the user combined with things like dynamic groups and then assigning things to those give us a lot of flexibility with that. And then I want to talk about internet and private access. These are newer features that have been added as part of the secure service edge capabilities of Entra. And there's a secure service edge, or the global secure access client gets installed on the client devices. It establishes a connection to the Entra edge. So if I think from a how this works scenario, where am I drawing? I'll do it over here. So again, Entra. And a key point, it's Entra, and you have conditional access policies are still applying to everything this does. So you have the secure services edge. I have my device. On my device, it installs this GSA client, which establishes a connection to the secure services edge. And now every request I make, everything I'm going to try and access through these technologies, it's going to be able to apply these policies to. Another thing here, because I have this GSA client, we talked about continuous access evaluation, the ability to immediately terminate tokens. This supports universal CAE. So because this client signs up for these revocation events, it can go and terminate my access in near real time if I need to. So there's two different types of things we can do here. We can do private access. So this would be, I have applications on a private network. This could be on site, it could be in a cloud, it doesn't matter. So I have some private network, and the way this works is it's going to add a connector, or n number of connectors, that establish the connection to the secure services edge. I then have resources that I want to make available, or I can also do something called a quick access. So quick access is a very broad range of IP addresses and ports that I want to make available. Let's say I'm replacing a VPN. So initially I need to make a whole bunch of stuff available. Then later on I can be more granular. I could look at what applications are actually being used, add specific apps, and then I can target conditional access at the quick access at the specific apps. So then when I want to access it, well, it's going via the secure services edge, has conditional access applied, and then I can go and talk to it. If I have private DNS, it hooks into the private DNS. The zones I have here, it makes known to the client, so I can still do single label type connectivity. So really the point here is it makes it completely seamless access to private network resources, no matter where the client is. It's not an open VPN tunnel with a whole range of things. It's always going via the secure services edge. It's always looking at every request. It's always applying that conditional access policy. And then the other thing we have is internet access. So the point of the internet access capability is, well, now we have the good old internet with all of the fantastic, never risky things that we have on the internet. And what I can do now is I can create security profiles that link to different sites and categories of websites. So I link to policies that I then link via conditional access. So now when I go and access the internet, it checks, is this site allowed? Is this category allowed? They're adding things like TLS inspections, so even if it's like a sub-site, it will be able to allow or deny based on category. But it's protecting the client from being phished, from tokens being stolen. It's a really nice additional set of capabilities that really light up for the user. So that's a big goal of what it's trying to do there. So, final thing, what about Active Directory in Azure? Because we talked about, you probably still need Active Directory. One option we have is, yes, you've got Active Directory. There's something called Entra Domain Services. So this would be used if I had some legacy app and I didn't have regular Active Directory domain services, or I didn't want to extend it into my Azure network, I can use this. Now, this is a managed domain. It creates domain controllers, but you don't see them. It's a one-way sync from Entra to these domain controllers. It does not replicate back the other way. And I can then have services go and use that for Kerberos, for NTLM. It is managed, so there's some limitations on it. I can't change the schema. I'm not a domain admin or an enterprise admin. I can't have those privileges. I can have multiple sets of these replicas. I can have up to 5 in total in connecting to different VNets. Those VNets must be peered because it creates really a mesh replication topology. They must all be in the same subscription. So that's one option. Another option is obviously if you already have AD, I can just extend that to Azure. And there's different options for that extension. So where have we got pictures of Entra? So imagine I've got my Active Directory here. So now I've got Azure. Remember, in Azure, we have a virtual network as our construct. And what is Active Directory? Active Directory is really a set of communication between the client and the domain controllers. So there's DCs sitting here, which sit on a network. So I need connectivity first and foremost. So this could be an express route private peering. This could be a site-to-site VPN, but there's a ability for packets to go from this network to this network. So I have visibility to these DCs. So my first option is just establish the connectivity, and then the DNS configuration of this VNet points to these DCs. So now it has name resolution and it has connectivity. It can use the domain. But if I'm putting important services in Azure, do I really want to have dependency on DCs on-prem and connectivity to on-prem? So what we're more likely to do is we'll add some replicas, some domain controllers in Azure as regular VMs. Our DNS would now point to these. And now what happens is this VNet becomes a new Active Directory site. This link becomes a new Active Directory site link. So it can architect the correct topology that it needs for the AD replication, because these have to be able to talk so it can replicate the various objects. So that's a very common way I'm going to put Active Directory in the cloud. And if I do that, there is an extension. There's a JSON AD domain extension that lets me automatically join Azure IaaS virtual machines to the Active Directory. I specify the domain, the OU, the credential I'd probably store in Key Vault. I don't want it sitting in a configuration file somewhere. And it would then just automatically go and join. So that was it for our identity module. Obviously, we covered a lot. We covered it quite quickly because there is so much. But it's key to understand the identity because it's the foundation of everything we're going to do. So it's really important to really understand the identity. I've got deep dive videos on everything I've talked about. But I hope that was useful. And I'll see you at the next module.